All right, are we ready to go ahead and call the meeting to order? All right, I see a thumbs up. All right, we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. And if we can, we'll go ahead and go around the room with the introductions. I'm not sure who the far left there, but if you want to go ahead and get started.
Yes, hi, Vice Chair. This is Carlos Rodriguez. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, Paul Avila, Paul Avila Associates.
John DeWitt, J. DeWitt Incorporated.
Jeff Blake, Metal Finishers Association and the Small Business Alliance.
David Rothbart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Rita Lou, Fratic International.
Nancy Feldman, Counsel's Office.
Lisa Tanaka, Senior Public Affairs Manager for Legislative Public Affairs. I'm stepping in for Derek this morning.
Todd Campbell, Vice President of Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs for Clean Energy.
All right. With that, we'll go into the minutes. We have the minutes from September 13th and October 11th, and I know we had some questions back on the September 13th minutes. Everyone had a chance to review both those. Anyone have any comments on those or questions?
Mr. Chair, this is David Rothbart. I do have a question as far as if there's a follow-up from staff as far as what the process is to provide recommendations. I read some old memos, thanks to Bill Lamar, from the formation of these committees, and it's pretty clear that we're supposed to come up with a consensus to provide advice to other committees. And the question really is, what is the formal process to come up with a consensus?
We'll be addressing that during the action items section of the agenda.
Very good. Short of that, I move approval of both minutes.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. I guess since we have a remote, we probably need to do a roll call, correct?
We don't have a quorum in the room, so I do recommend it.
Okay, so will the clerk go ahead and call a roll call then?
We don't actually have a clerk, but Elaine, why don't you step in, and we'll call for a roll call on approval of the minutes. If we could just go around the room and indicate how you vote.
Aye.
Approve.
Yes. Aye.
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
And I hear. Okay, with that, we'll go on to the follow-up and action items. And since Derek's not here, go right ahead.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Benoit. So the action items, the first one was the September 13 minutes, and we just voted to approve them. And then there was an item where Mr. Aguirre had asked about Excite, and I believe that staff forwarded some information, and I believe Derek Alatorre actually attended the meeting last evening. And then the last item, Nancy is going to provide clarification on the procedure for the advisory group to provide input to the governing board.
You all have attached to your agendas a copy of the group charter for the formation of this particular advisory group. And if I call your attention to the mission statement, you'll see how broad it is. And essentially, you are authorized to provide input on the implementation of the AQMD and a host of other subjects. You can provide input into essentially anything within the jurisdiction of the South Coast AQMD. And more specifically, of course, how it impacts the constituency of this particular advisory group. What is sorely lacking is the process. So if you look at the reporting section, which is on the second page of the charter, it calls for monthly reports to the admin committee on your activities and results. And in keeping with that, My recommendation would be that if you have consensus on any particular recommendation you want to forward to the governing board in terms of actions they might take or policies that they may adopt, that you do it through the admin committee. This could be done because there is no formal process, either through a letter that is adopted through an action by this group, and it would require consensus and the vote with a quorum approving the action to be taken. You could do it by letter, memo, or you could appear before the admin committee, and during the public comment period of the admin committee, bring your recommendations and comments to them for the specific purpose of forwarding it to the full board. Yes.
Thank you. So just in the example that began this dialogue was a public comment was made, I believe, by the gas company, and they were making an appeal or recommendation regarding the asbestos rule,
Yes, I remember.
related rule, and they were furthermore requesting that prior to a formal decision being made, that I believe it was an ad hoc committee or some type of additional dialogue formally occur. So I do believe it was an ad hoc committee. So at that point, we I think had a consensus amongst this body to respectfully request that staff consider that. So in light of what you just said, how would we handle a similar type of situation where we would hear a public comment, we had unanimous consensus and wanted to impart that to staff and to the appropriate next step? Who would that be? Would it be the
It would be the
administrative?
the admin committee, but because that was an item that was not agendized, and if it is something that comes up in public comment that would instigate this body to take a formal action, I would recommend that what you're really doing is requesting that it be agendized for the next meeting. And then you could come prepared at the next meeting with what form you'd like to advance that recommendation, what form you'd like that to take, whether it would be to send a representative to the next admin committee meeting, or whether it would be to actually approve and adopt a written recommendation that you could prepare prior to and distribute in time for noticing requirements prior to the next meeting, a memo or a letter to be signed by the members. These are all available to you.
So in other words, we would, again, going back to that example, if we heard a compelling public comment and we wanted to support that sentiment, recommendation, whatever it may be,
Right.
we would have to put it on the agenda, come back the next month, and
right.
determine how we wanted to present that, whether it's a letter or we have to wait till the next meeting.
Well, yes, because it's an action item that would, it doesn't, this process, whatever it is, would still have to comply with Brown Act. So
Okay.
other members of the public need to be given an opportunity to come to a meeting and comment on what that, in this case, let's say, what the gas company said.
Oh,
And
I thought
what
that was on the
what
agenda though that day.
It
That was
wasn't,
the
as I
con,
recall. That's
the
why
topic. It was an actual presentation that we received, I believe,
There
that
was
day.
something akin to it, but I don't remember
Yeah.
specifically
Their
enough, so I
comment
don't
was
wanna
specifically on that
correct-
agenda. That's why
correct
they
you.
were there that day. So I'm just,
Right.
I guess the only question I would have is the ability to, in a timely manner, have this group present input and advise. And if, let's say, there were between this meeting and next meeting, if there were some decisions that were going to be made, we would not be.
If I could jump in for a second, Carlos,
Yeah.
I think that what you're suggesting is good, but the good news is we have 3 board members, at least one normally here, but we have 2 other board members as well that could convey any of those messages back to the body, whether that be at the stationary source meeting that would happen the following week or at the governing board meeting. So there is an ability for this body to, if everyone said, hey, Ben, this is how we feel, I could bring that comment up at the board meeting. So that's an option, recognizing that it would just be a comment, not a formal action or a formal letter. But yeah, I do understand that we would have to, if we needed to do a formal letter, that would have to come back on the agenda at the following meeting. But don't be afraid to ever, if this group all feels the same way about a particular item, that's something I need to know so I can carry that message back to the governing board.
And that's a great point. I think just the nimble ability of just having you take the message to the appropriate channels and not have to wait for a letter or somewhere to get that sentiment to where it needs to go. So
always
thanks.
an option when the board member's there.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Rita.
So David was talking about this memo or the resolution adopted by the board, 98-1, adopted November 13th, 1998, which governs advisory committees and talks about creating consensus and how we're not voting entities, but we shall strive for consensus and report to the respective board committee. So I think there's some sort of a process laid out. I guess as a committee member, it's not clear what the specific steps would be, because traditionally this committee has not taken any positions or expressed any, consensus in a strong, organized way. Rather we just hear staff presentations. So would it be worth exploring as members, if we do have an item where we have consensus and there's a lot of interest, how we communicate that? It sounds like maybe the specifics is what's missing.
Well, there is something missing in terms of process and how to advance an idea, but the vice chair has given you the most expeditious means by which to do that, which is to communicate through any board member who is in attendance at the meeting, and they will faithfully bring that back to the appropriate committee or the governing board, whichever is meeting next. But if this committee wants to make a stand and make a statement as a body, that would have to be agendized, and then you can determine what the content of that statement is precisely and how you would like it conveyed, whether it's through personal appearance at the meeting or via a memo or letter that is signed by committee members. But agendizing it for the next meeting also gives you an opportunity to consider how you would like it phrased and framed.
Hi there. I assume we're talking about proposed amended Rule 1403?
We're not talking about anything in particular right now.
But that's what prompted the
But
discussion?
that's what prompted the discussion.
So just FYI, because I was following that professionally, that amended rule, that proposed rule has been put on hold indefinitely. I don't know if that's been discussed. Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you. I just want to make that.
No, that's true. But I was approaching this generically, yes, because this is this is a matter that could come up. Any other questions?
Real quick, just to consolidate this as far as due process. I understand Brown Act, but just say we ask Ben to convey a consensus. Would it be appropriate for someone to say, I have a motion to get to consensus? We're not voting, but would that be an appropriate way to gain consensus? I'm looking for a way to proceed without going afoul of the rules.
Well, I think the vote is what establishes consensus. So if there is, using the example that came up with 1403, and there is a desire on the part of this committee to recommend to the governing board that some other committee be established, an ad hoc committee that is specifically devoted to an action that is before the board or is being considered by the district itself, just by taking a vote on whether this committee should report to either the next stationary source committee meeting, admin committee meeting, or governing board meeting, whichever is most appropriate, will establish consensus to go forward. Did you have another question, John?
So if we put that together, say the committee puts a resolution together with an advice 72 hours before this meeting, then that consensus can be arrived at the meeting, is that correct?
Yes, it would be an action item that you would have to vote on, and the vote would determine consensus.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions on that? Not seeing any. We can go ahead and go on to the first discussion item, the cap and trade overview. Sarah.
Good morning. So I'm going to give an overview of cap and trade concept in general, and then a very high-level overview of California's cap and trade program. I will point out that in the district we don't really deal with this program at all, but we know we had a request to kind of go over this, is give us sort of a 101 on cap and trade, and so that's what we're going to do. If I can get the presentation to work. Great. So just wanted to start giving an overview of current greenhouse gas emissions in California. The charts on the right, you can see how we have reduced emissions over time, starting in 2000, despite growth in population, despite growth in GDP. So even with a strong economy, we've been still able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, both total greenhouse gas emissions as well as emissions per capita, which is really important. You can see that there was a pretty big dip sort of in the 2007, 2008, 2009 range. That was reflective of the economic downturn that was experienced throughout the whole country. In terms of where these greenhouse gas emissions come from, the bulk of the emissions are from transportation. That's consistent with what you'll see in a lot of other states. In California, our power profile, with the amount of emissions we get from electricity, is a little smaller than some other places. Our power supply is relatively clean in terms of greenhouse gases, and so that's why that's a little lower. But overall, this is a fairly consistent representation of greenhouse gas emissions compared to what other states would have. Our 2017 total greenhouse gas emissions, 424 million metric tons CO2. That's equivalent to about approximately, well, I guess it's just under what a country like Germany would emit. So it's fairly significant. High-level concept on cap and trade. This is a market-based system to reduce emissions. So the idea that is instead of having a regulatory command and control program where specific technologies are required or specific emissions have to be hit, you let the market provide a way to get to those reductions. The theory is it's supposed to provide the most flexible, economically efficient way to get those emission reductions. Cap and trade programs can be economy-wide, or they can be limited to specific sectors. I'm going to go through some examples of cap and trade programs so you can see some of those differences. In terms of common features, they do establish cap for emissions, so emissions are ultimately capped. Those caps reduce over time, so you get those emission reductions that way. Covered facilities that are included within that cap are provided a certain amount of emissions. It's called allocating those emissions. And then they have different options to meet those allocations. So they can meet that allocation by reducing their emissions to make sure it fits the allocation they're provided. They can buy offsets, or they can buy credits or use bank credits to meet that allocation. And again, I mentioned that the cap it's designed to reduce over time, so you're actually getting emission reductions. Very basic approach. So I have two facilities, facility A, facility B. These are, we'll say they're identical facilities. One looks bigger than the other because one is emitting more than the other, but they're supposed to be identical facilities. And so you can see the dashed line is establishing the cap. If the facility A is emitting below that cap, so it's generating credits. Facility B is emitting above that cap, it needs credits. There's a trading body. These entities can sell credits to that trading body. They can buy credits from that body. And then we also have this concept of offsets, which are emission projects to get emission reductions. And they also generate credits that go into that trading body to provide that supply. So it's a very, very simplified approach on cap and trade. it gets very complicated. California's program is very complicated. I'm only going to cover this at a very high level, but it is very, very complex. So some examples of cap and trade programs, there are examples of SO2 and NOx emission control programs. So we have one right here in Reclaim that has been ongoing since 1994, a fairly famous example. We are in the process of winding Reclaim down, but that has been running for many years here. EPA's acid rain trading program, which started in 1995, was envisioned in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. That's cited as a fairly successful example of getting very efficient emission reductions on acid rain precursors. That program was limited to power plants. In terms of greenhouse gas cap and trade programs, the EU emission trading scheme is really kind of the leader there. That's been running since 2005 in different forms. It's still going today. It's the largest cap and trade program in the world. We also have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or the RGGI program, that's operating in the US in the Northeast states, and that covers power plant sector in the Northeast. Of course, we have California's Cap and Trade Program and the Western Climate Initiative, which is a consortium of, it started out as a consortium of states and Canadian provinces, as well as some Mexican states. Right now, that trading, or the trading aspect of WCI, is limited to California and the province of Quebec. And then there's other countries. So New Zealand has a cap and trade program. Korea has one. Japan has one. China is looking into a national cap and trade program. Different Chinese provinces and cities also have cap and trade programs that are instituting. One important point about the Chinese cap and trade programs is they tend to be rate-based instead of mass-based. And the difference with that is that in China, so they will have a cap based on tied to their production. So it means that it meets those industries can be more efficient in that they can produce more and produce more compared to the greenhouse gases they emit. But it may mean that at the end of the day, actual greenhouse gas emissions go up. So that's a key distinction there. And a quick overview of our cap and trade system here in California. This is a comprehensive, economy-wide, mass-based greenhouse gas emission program. So it is very specifically designed to get emission reductions and to cover a large portion of the economy. It was initiated in 2013 as part of the Western Climate Initiative framework. Right now, it is linked to Quebec, the province of Quebec, which is the only other participating WCI state or entity. For a brief period of time, the province of Ontario was linked, but they had a change in their government and they pulled out. It's administered by CARB, and then also WCI itself has an overall administrating entity that has a role. And it's the fourth largest cap and trade program for greenhouse gases in the world. And we're doing this really to get to the California greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So we have a target in 2020 of reaching 1990 levels at that time, which would be 431 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. We need to get 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. Question?
Sarah, enlighten me here. In the Chinese model, with more production, there's a cap. Now, in reduction, would it work the other way around? There's a reduction in the cap ingredients. Is that correct? Let's say it was a steel plant.
Okay.
And they had a great year. I mean, tons of steel. The following year, they didn't. They couldn't get some ingredients, whatever the case is. Now, would that level drop?
So in a mass-based system, they're given an allocation of tons of emissions based on, and it's you allocate it based on what you think their production is going to be. So one year they have a banner year and they produce way more. Arguably they have more greenhouse gases associated with that. They might have to go out and buy credits to make up for that. If the next year they don't have a great year and they produce much less, they would actually generate credits because it was expected that they were going to produce X amount and they produce less than it. In a Chinese system, a rate-based system, if the amount of steel they produced per ton of greenhouse gases is the same, even though they produced a lot less of it, there wouldn't be much of a difference. But what it means is that from the amount of tons of greenhouse gases, they're not limited into how much they can produce. They can continue to produce and produce, and greenhouse gases ultimately could go up over time. So it's a system that's I mean, targeted to efficiency of facilities, but not targeted to actually getting mass reductions. So kind of the key components of the California system, again, is it's designed to really maximize flexibility for the covered entities so that they can comply with their obligations at the lowest cost options. And so the way they comply is by getting allowances, buying allowances, and also these offset credits. It is by design designed to link with other cap and trade programs. And the reason for that is under economic theory, the bigger the market, the more efficient the market, the easier it is to, or the more economically efficient it is to comply. It provides for investments. Investments is a very key aspect of this program. So proceeds from the auctions are then turned back to fund greenhouse gas emission reduction projects, and then also to help and target potential localized community impacts. And then there's very strong greenhouse gas reporting and compliance features, because you need to make sure that you have a strong understanding of how many greenhouse gases are being emitted, how many are being reduced as a result of the program, and then make sure that the market is not being gamed.
Now, is it an international auction or just domestic?
So our auctions, because we're linked with Quebec, they are joint auctions with the province of Quebec. In terms of coverage, it started out covering major stationary sources, power plants, transportation fuels were recently added in 2015. So if an entity emits greater than 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents a year, when I say CO2 equivalents, that's carbon dioxide, but there's also other greenhouse gases that are associated with that. And the reason we talk about equivalence is that carbon dioxide is sort of the baseline greenhouse gas, but the other greenhouse gases are actually a lot more potent than carbon dioxide. So for example, methane is a very common greenhouse gas, and it's about 24 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So all of these gases, whatever you emit, it's converted back into the equivalence of carbon dioxide to total up. So our plan also covers importers of electricity, which is really important because we import a decent chunk. And if you look back to the first slide I showed, it's maybe 6%, I think, of our total power is imported. And then covered entities that are included under the cap, they get permits, and that gives their compliance obligation, what they need to meet every 3 years. It covers approximately 450 entities. It's about 85% of our state greenhouse gas emissions. The cap was established in 2013. At that time, it was established at 2% less than what our projected emissions were from those covered sectors. The cap is designed to decline by 3% every year, and it's really tied at meeting those greenhouse gas emission targets that I talked about in a previous slide. So our mandatory reporting rule, this has actually been going on since 2008. So we have now at this point over 10 years of information that we can look at. This covers, again, the entities that are covered under the cap and trade program. Those emissions need to be reported annually to CARB, but it covers entities that also don't have an obligation of the cap and trade program, because it's everybody who emits greater than 10,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalents a year. And the reason it's that threshold is lower than the participants for cap and trade is you want to get a very good idea of what your greenhouse gas emission inventory is, who's emitting what, and better ways to monitor the system. Emission reports that entities submit to CARB, those are required to be reviewed by third-party independent verifiers. So there's a high level of scrutiny on those emission reports to make sure that they are accurate. Cap and trade compliance obligations. So I mentioned we have this cap that was established. It was adjusted in 2015 when we added transportation emissions, because you're adding a big segment of greenhouse gas emissions. Declines every 3 years every year by 3%. A compliance obligation, that's the word for how much greenhouse gas emissions a covered entity is allowed to emit. So they have to buy credits to cover their compliance obligation. They can sell credits if they emit less than their compliance obligation. And those credits, we call them in the form of allowances or offset credits. So there's a couple of ways you can get those. You can acquire them by free allocation from CARB. So CARB can just give you a bunch. And in fact, right now, the market is working that way, where CARB gives you most of the allocation you need. You can purchase, if you need more credits than that to meet your obligation, say you had a banner year and you emitted a lot more, you can go to the one of the quarterly auctions and buy credits. You can buy them also through secondary markets. So there is a secondary market of trading between private entities that happens outside of the auction process. And then you can also use banked allowances. Say you didn't emit as much as what your allocation was, you're allowed to bank those credits and hold on to them for future years. So an allowance is an instrument that's created by CARB. It is the equivalent of 1 metric ton of CO2. And it's basically a tradable permit for a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. Yes.
When you're trading on your previous slide, purchasing from the secondary market, let's use example, the steel plant would trade credits with another steel plant. It wouldn't trade with somebody else, another industry of some type.
You can trade with another industry. The secondary market is, it's just private contracts between entities that are covered by the program. So it just means that it's a trade that happens outside of the state-run auction process.
And there's different valuations, I'm assuming.
There's different valuations. The secondary market tends to price carbon a little higher than what we have in our auctions, just because it's a different demand component to that.
Then, as far as the rate and the amount of the purchasing price of a credit, can you give us some context of how much?
So in the most recent auction in August of this year, it was trading at, I think, $17.15 a ton. That's pretty cheap in terms of valuing carbon.
In a secondary market, what would be a
secondary
difference?
market is about $1 more expensive than that.
Okay.
So it's not very much. And I'm going to get more into pricing and auctioning further on in the presentation.
Thank you.
So allocation, the allocation, as is mentioned right now, CARB is mostly providing free allowances to covered entities. So they're industrial entities, power generators and importers, and natural gas providers. Right now they're getting about 90% of their average emissions free from CARB. There are provisions built in to recognize more efficient industrial operators because we want to reward efficiency. Being able to produce more for less greenhouse gases is a good thing. Right now, utilities that are getting their free allowances, they are required to sell those at auction, and then you turn those proceeds around to benefit their ratepayers or to get additional greenhouse gas emission reductions. Transportation fuels, they have to provide or buy all of their allowances that they need. So if you need additional allowances, you have options within the quarterly auctions that CARB holds and also the private secondary markets. You can buy offsets, and you can also use your previously banked credits if you have those. There are some limits placed on this. So, for example, the use of offsets is limited to 8% of the total compliance obligation. That is set to ratchet down in the future. And I'm going to talk about offsets in a future slide. And then this entity called the Compliance Instrument Tracking System Service, that's the entity that tracks credits. Basically, you want to be able to follow them, understand what their dispositions, to make sure that there's no gaming of the market. So offsets, these are basically greenhouse gas emissions associated with projects. So reductions associated with projects specifically targeted to get greenhouse gas emission reductions. Different categories that are recognized under this program. So there's some forestry projects, livestock management programs, ozone depletion projects, mine methane capture, and then some agricultural projects. Right now, California's program limits the use of offsets just to projects in the U.S. So there could be these types of projects happening all over the world. Theoretically, those could be used, but when you invest in a project in a different country, there's less certainty that the protocols are being followed, so that you're actually getting that emission reduction. So it's a lot cleaner just to limit the use of that domestically. CARB administers a database of certified offset projects that are available. So if I'm a covered entity and I want to buy a bunch of offsets, I can go to this database and I can figure out what's available and go out and buy that. These offsets, if it turns out that those projects don't actually result in the emission reductions they're supposed to, CARB can go ahead and invalidate those credits later on. So it's a little bit of a risk, and it's one of the reasons why the type of offset projects are very stringently controlled. Auctions. So I mentioned that both California and the province of Quebec's programs, they have been linked since 2014, and they have joint auctions. They hold their auctions quarterly. These are subject to independent audits. Again, when you're controlling a fairly large market and a lot of dollars associated with it, you want to make sure that things are being run appropriately and that there's no market manipulation. So, concept called the auction reserve price. We do actually set a minimum accepted price for an allowance. That was set initially at 10 metric tons of carbon, $10 per metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalents. That increases every year by 5%, and then also is adjusted for inflation. Auction settlement price, that's the price at which all available allowances are sold during a particular auction. So I have an example here. These were the current allowances. They're selling slightly above the auction reserve. So in our last auction, which was in August, it was $17.16 per metric ton of CO2e. Yes.
On your previous slide, you said when you decide that you're not meeting the targets, are you using the MATES program to measure the results, or are you doing a computer model?
So for offsets, if it's the project, say it's a forestry project, so I'm planting trees in a way that's going to sequester carbon. If it turns out that for whatever reason that project wasn't run properly, and it doesn't, there's metrics that they use and standards that they use to evaluate whether that project is actually going to result in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's independent from anything we would do here.
But it's a computer program. It's not an actual measurement of the air.
It's not an actual monitored measurement. It's something that we model, that we from developing particular standards by which projects are administered. As long as they meet those standards, we model that they are going to get those emission reductions.
In your opinion, is the modeling reflecting real life?
So the concept of offset projects is very controversial. It's something that a lot of folks oppose because they don't think that those emission reductions are real, as well as many of those projects involve carbon sequestration, where there's not emission reductions, just that carbon is taken away and put in a way that it's taken out of the atmosphere, but it doesn't go away. Mm-hmm. So, in the case of forestry offsets, for example, theoretically, many years down the road, that carbon could be released back to the atmosphere. So there's a great deal of controversy about the use of offsets. In California, again, we do limit them. You can't buy all of the allocation that you need through offsets. It's limited to 8%. It is going to be ratcheted down over the years. Eventually, it will likely get more and less phased out.
So on any of our programs that we're using to mitigate, is there any measurement of the air itself with a MATES program, or is that all computer modeling on any of the programs?
So we here in South Coast don't measure greenhouse gas emissions or do monitoring for that. There are atmospheric measurements of greenhouse gas emissions and of ambient CO2, so that is measured, but it's not necessarily tied to these regulatory programs. Yes.
Just more of a theoretical question. If I buy credits, say I'm in a steel industry, for whatever, and I've got a surplus of them, now can I use them for other than trading or allocation? Let's say I want to translate that into I'm a good corporate citizen and I'm going to do something for the community. Is that feasible?
If you want to retire them, for example?
That's a good way to say it.
Yeah, you're able to retire. The idea is that there's a monetary value associated with those credits, so maybe you want to get them. But yeah, if you retire them, you're still going to get an emission reduction, right? So.
Thank you.
Okay. So compliance periods. First, the program started off in 2013. So the first compliance period was a 2-year period, 2013 through 2014. The next 2 compliance periods are in 3-year increments, and they'll be going from 3-year increments thereon. The way this works is you don't want to wait until the end of your compliance period to tee up. You don't want to wait all the way to the end and show the credits to make sure you meet your allocation. So the rule is set up in a way that you turn in allowances and offsets to meet up 30% of your obligation within the beginning of each year. So you want to make sure that that's all staggered out, and then within 10 months of the end of the compliance period, you turn in the rest of your allowances and offsets. So it's a forcing mechanism to make sure people don't wait up to the end to turn in everything. There are some pretty severe consequences to meeting a compliance deadline. So if you fail to turn in enough, you have to turn in an additional 4 allowances for every ton you missed. So that's a pretty stringent obligation. Again, the program is designed to get emission reductions and to make sure that those compliance periods are met. So the investment piece is very important. With any of these markets, you can generate a lot of money, and it's important to be able to turn that back into, getting further greenhouse gas emission reductions or other projects. So the legislature appropriates money from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which was established to house the proceeds from California's program. To date, about $11 billion has been appropriated, and those funds go to a fairly diverse range of projects that are tied back to hit California's climate goals. So there's some transportation and sustainable community projects, clean energy and energy efficiency projects, and then also projects for natural resources and waste diversion. And if you want more information on that, CARB has a pretty comprehensive list of different types of projects that they fund and track that very closely. So I'm going to end with just some ideas. Cap and trade programs are pretty fraught, but there's some key issues that come up a lot, and we've seen this play out in many of these cap and trade programs. So one is the idea of over-allocation, that you give the entity more allowances than they actually need. So the way that's supposed to be, in theory, if you're reporting greenhouse gas emissions, you have a pretty good idea of what an entity has and what they need, and so you can set that allocation appropriately. But in practice, there has been a problem with over-allocation, and so a great example of that is what happened with the EU emission trading scheme, where when they initially started in 2005, they didn't have a good idea of how many emission or greenhouse gas emissions were associated with each country, and they relied on each member country to establish their own cap. Well, in self-interest, you're going to set that cap as big as you can, and that's what happened. And so the market had a lot of problems functioning in the beginning. We had a little bit of that issue here in California. It seems to have resolved itself now. The way that problem manifested is we couldn't sell all of the allowances that were available every auction. We didn't sell all of them out. We only sold a portion of them, and it's because the demand wasn't there. But as we see right now, we sell out all of the allowances that are available every quarter, and the price is above the floor, the minimum price it's set. So we are seeing that demand signal pick up. The other problem with cap and trade is sometimes it doesn't actually result in emission reductions. So this is a bigger problem with the rate-based systems, not as much for the mass-based systems, but there's no necessarily guarantee at the end of the day that emissions are going to go down. As long as there's ways in which people can buy credits and kind of buy more, and this is a big criticism by a lot of environmental groups, you may not get that guaranteed reduction of emissions at the end of the day. There's also a lot of administrative burden associated with cap and trade programs. You have really just scratched the surface today in talking about the components of California's program. There's a lot of things to monitor and to watch and evaluate and ensure that there's no market manipulation and the market is functioning appropriately. So one alternative approach that's been talked about a lot is the idea of a carbon tax. If the idea is to put a price on carbon, just tax it directly to the entity, and then let them figure out the most efficient way to meet that cost. Some entities, for example, the province of British Columbia, at one point had both a cap and trade system and a carbon tax in place. I wasn't exactly sure why, but I think they've backed away from that since then. Leakage. Leakage is another important concept. So leakage is the idea that you have a regulation in place, a requirement to reduce greenhouse gases, and the entity just leaves the state. But those greenhouse gases are then produced somewhere else, and so carbon dioxide emissions are still going up, even though you have this regulation in place. And so that's something that it's one of the reasons why it's important that we included imported power in California's cap and trade program, because you didn't want more power that was generated in the state to pack up, leave the states, and then have more of that imported power that was not covered. So that's a very key concern. And then we have the concept of energy intensive trade exposed industries. So these are industries like steel. Steel is a classic example of that, that take a lot of power, a lot of resources to be able to produce their products, but they're trade exposed. They could pick up and relocate anywhere. And so, they're still going to be generating those emissions, but they wouldn't be covered by your program. Yes.
There we go, testing. I come to you, Sarah, let's say you're the CARB financial woman. And I come to you at the end of the year, I like to believe they put out an annual report. And I'm gonna ask you, because there's gotta be line items, and there must be astronomical as far as the numbers go. Who audits this financially? Is there a firm that bids this every year? And let's say I wanna look at the cap and trade annual report, for lack of better terms.
Yeah, so they don't have an annual report. What they do is they have reports that come. So they have several levels of reports. They have comprehensive reports that come out after every quarterly auction. So because that's one thing, you want to make sure that auction functioned properly, that nobody was gaming the system, that everything was kosher. And the auctions, they generate a lot of proceeds. The last auction, I believe, it's something like $680 million was generated. So, and again, $11 billion over the history of the program so far. It's a chunk of change. So you have that level of reporting. There's a big report that's generated after every compliance period. So right now we have 3-year compliance periods. At the end of those compliance periods, there's a very comprehensive report that's generated. It's subject to third-party auditing. So there's several places in the process when emissions are reported. Those are subject to independent third-party verifiers. California has auditors that come in and look at their program when they're doing their 3-year annual reports. So it's really important to have that level of oversight and to be very thorough, because there's very real money associated with this. So on the energy-intensive trade-exposed industries, cement is another example of that. And in fact, when I was working in the state of Washington on climate policies, we ran into the problem where our cement industry was being relocated to Asia because it was cheaper to make cement in Asia and ship it to Seattle than it was to make it in Seattle. And so a lot of times cap-and-trade programs will take a lot of provisions to help these EITI industries. So they'll either give them extra allowances or some other boost to put them on even footing so that you don't lose that industry. I guess it could be looked at as protectionism, yeah, but it's understanding that because of the trade dynamics, these industries are very vulnerable to those effects. And I think that's all I have. So if there's any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Go ahead, Carlos.
On the reporting rule, whether it's the electricity generators or industrial facilities, fuel suppliers, et cetera, does their cap vary, or is it a standardized cap for each of those?
So they are given a cap in their permit. It's tied to what they're projected to generate, and then it's what their emissions are, according to what they're projected to generate, and then that is declined over time. So that ratchets down over time.
So would there be a variation in the cap from industry to industry, or?
So it's all dependent on what their average emissions were at some point in time. That's how the initial cap is established, and then it's just it's a glide path that reduces down over time.
And the example you gave on the kind of the basic approach, facility A, facility B, can you put some context to how much? There was an example of 17 dollars per metric ton. So could you give an example of what a amount might be for any of these industry examples?
So right now, this covers very large facilities. If you emit over 25,000 metric tons per year, which is what you would need to emit to be covered by this program, you're pretty big.
Okay.
Right now, California is giving you 90% of those, what you need in terms of meeting your allocation. So you're on the hook for 10%. So, that should give you some idea of what
the minimum threshold to qualify for
Right.
this is 25,000
25,000
annually.
Yes, that's what you have to emit every year to be covered by this program. So it's about 450 entities in California.
And so 10% of that 25,000 metric tons.
If that's what your emissions are. Now, some people, a power plant can emit many, many more amounts of that. So,
But at a minimum threshold to qualify, it would be 25,000, and you would have 10% of that. You would have to pay that $17 per metric ton. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Have we, out of the 450 entities, this started back in, have you measured how many of those entities we have kept and how many of those entities have left?
I don't have that information, but that's something that you can probably find out from CARB's website. I will say that there's not been that kind of backlash in terms of in California. There's other economic forces in place, such as why facilities, certainly facilities of that magnitude, locate in the state and continue to run in the state.
Okay, Councilman Benoit, there's no other questions? Oh, sorry, Rita, I apologize.
Thank you.
Wait, when did you show up?
I was here, no, I think he's talking to me.
Not Rita. No, I know Rita's been here the whole time, but you weren't here earlier. Okay, go ahead, Rita.
Okay, thank you. Just following up on Carlos's question, can you give us a sense on the cost that an average facility is seeing? You mentioned 90% of the allowances you get from the state, but typically, on an average, do you have a sense of what they're paying, what the cost is to the facility?
Again, I don't really have that sense. I mean, it depends on how much they emit, and so that's I can give you an idea of what you're going to have to pay per ton. We know that price from the auctions. I will say that the price per ton is pretty low, considering if your goal is really to get emission reductions. Most economists think you probably have to be in the range of about $50 per ton in order to make that work. So ultimately, the goal is that these prices are going to go up if you have enough of a demand signal. But yeah, you would have to know sort of what average facility emissions are and be able to figure that out to understand what they're paying today.
Okay, and then I thought I saw an announcement from CARB that the state had already met or was meeting the targets ahead of schedule. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, CARB has, so the first target was in 2020, coming up on 2020, and it's to get our greenhouse gas emissions down to 1990 levels by that time, and we are ahead of that. There's some ideas as to why. Certainly, I think the cap and trade program is a helpful piece, but we also had a fairly significant economic downturn in the late 2000s, and that contributed as well.
David, go ahead.
All right.
Thank you. One more question, maybe for Derek since he's here. As far as the overall effectiveness of this program, as far as reducing emissions, there isn't the same rigorous analysis that CARB is performing like South Coast and saying how many tons you need to reduce for a certain amount of money. The cost effectiveness is a little bit more loosey-goosey in my understanding. And it'd be nice to somehow advocate for, if you have $11 billion, that it's invested in something that really gets you good emission reductions, and that just for the whole state. But specifically for South Coast, have we made any progress in maybe getting a bigger piece of the pie as far as proceeds that are collected to go to emission reductions? I know that's been discussed, but I haven't heard an update recently.
So no, we try every year. We ask for more money coming from GGRF, especially for AB 617 programs. When you got 60% of those monies already being allocated for high-speed rail, and then there's, forget what allocation is for, housing. You know, it's really tough. There's not too much room for them to allocate, and there's a lot of competing interests on this. We try, and you know, we do get some allocation, but it's not what it needs to be. This is all supposed to be, you know, supposed to also be for, you know, emission reductions, but you know, unfortunately, we don't have control over how the allocation goes.
I understand it's hard to fight over the money in Sacramento, but maybe an approach that might be effective, and you know better than I do, as far as pushing the cost effectiveness. If you're going to use the money, make sure you're actually getting emission reductions for it, and maybe that would point it in the right direction. I don't know if that would have any legs in Sacramento or not, but just an idea.
They got their mindset where, at least the previous governor was very supportive of the high-speed rail. Current governor at first came out of the gate, he wasn't as supportive, but then he changed his mind. I think it's going to be very difficult because there's a lot of powerful interests that are vying for that money for high-speed rail. And it's tough for a district like ours, or even for all the districts in the state, to go compete for that money when you have other interests vying for very powerful interests. Yes, Jeff. Jeff?
Yeah, is it possible for a company foreseeing a rise in the cost of these credits to bank them now at $17 for their future use?
You are able to bank credits. There's limitations on how long you can bank credits, but there are provisions to do that. I'd have to go look. It used to be a 3-year banking scheme, but I'll have to go and take a look. With credits, as you get them, every year there's different credits, so they have what we call different vintages, so they're tagged to different years, and that's something that CARB tracks very slowly as well. So you have to like separate out your 2015 credits from your 2016, 2017, etc.
Okay, Mr. DeWitt.
Dennis, just as a question, you have a very diverse group that impacts lots and lots of people here on your small business advisory group. And my question to you is, it looks as if the politics side and the pressure side sometimes outweighs reality. Is that a reasonable question?
That's the real world, yeah.
Okay. But you have I'm very good at whining and sniveling to my local politicians, and I wondered, you have never asked us to do any work for you.
That's because we're not allowed to ask you.
Oh.
We can educate you.
You can educate us,
We
right?
can educate you, but we cannot ask you to go and oppose a bill.
All right, very good. Okay, with that, I think we're ready to go into the AB 617. Thank you, Sarah Reese, for a great presentation. And Vicki White.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. This presentation will provide an update on the AB 617 Community Air Protection Incentives Program. Sarah just mentioned the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and covered kind of at a higher level what some of the, this fund receives revenue from the cap and trade program. And she also identified some of the higher level categories these revenues are used for. One of them is for the AB 617 Community Air Protection Program. And I'm going to go ahead and jump into what that means for the South Coast AQMD. Back in 2017, the governor signed AB 134. I may have been here about a year and a half ago giving you an update on this program. So this bill set aside $250 million statewide for what was referred to as early action projects that were intended to reduce emissions in disadvantaged and low-income communities. This bill, as you may know, was approved well before any specific communities being identified under the 617 program. However, it was targeting all disadvantaged and low-income communities in the state of California. For South Coast AQMD, we were allocated $107.5 million. specifically for these early action projects. And of that, roughly 6.25% were set aside for administrative costs. So that left about 100 million left dedicated to funding projects that will reduce emissions in these communities. And this bill specifically mentioned how these, what projects were supposed to be used with these funds. And these were projects that were submitted specifically through the Carl Moyer program and the Prop 1B goods movement programs. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is this bill set a pretty ambitious liquidation deadline. So by June 30th, 2021, which isn't too far off, these funds have to be completely allocated and spent with the equipment deployed, so fully liquidated by this date. And that leaves us only about 2 years left to be able to liquidate all the funds. So real quick, we've awarded all the AB 134 funds to projects, and these funds are now in various stages of deployment. What happened in 2018, the governor signed another bill called SB 856. And this bill was a little broader in focus. It set aside $245 million statewide with the intent to continue supporting the goals of AB 617. Of this, AQMD received about 85.57 million allocated for projects, and same administrative funds could be set aside to implement the program. And this spending deadline is just 1 year after the AB 134 program. So again, very ambitious. And to give you a reference point, the Carl Moyer program that we run every year has a 4-year liquidation timeline. This one's roughly about 2.5 years by the time we receive the funds from ARB. It's a very tight time frame to get all these funds spent according to the legislative deadline. Yes, sir.
Now, Vicki, this is real money, right? Not theoretical stuff where, well, I've got it in a boxcar coming from Sacramento and it should get here next week. This actual green dollars, right?
It is, and we have these funds here. Okay. SB 856 is the funds are not yet here, but we'll be applying to receive these funds in December.
Speaking to the mic.
What % of those funds are already earmarked?
For the first year, AB 134, all have been allocated to projects. This year, I'm going to give you an update right now. We haven't allocated or awarded any of these projects yet. We're scheduled for December board, and I'll be giving you kind of some introduction into what those project awards are shaping up to look like. What this bill did was, you guys may realize this bill was a broader bill. It kind of went beyond the identifying just mobile sources as being eligible projects. It included stationary sources and also projects that are identified through community emission reduction plans. But for sure, mobile sources being a primary concern, basically any mobile source projects submitted under this year's Carl Moyer program may be considered for these year 2 incentives. One of the things we did was we released the Moyer announcement in March. It closed in June. And again, similar to previous years, we were heavily oversubscribed. Our annual Moyer program is funded with about $30 million each year. We got $240 million in funding requests. Luckily, we can, with that many projects potentially being eligible for funding, we can hopefully be able to use the community air protection funds to help meet that demand in funding requests for the program. And I just wanted to highlight the priority for these funds is basically projects that are domiciled or operated a majority of time in the priority communities. And the bill specifically said not just the communities not just the communities that have been approved, but also the communities that are under consideration for approval. One of the things we did this year was we did some enhanced outreach efforts that went beyond what we normally do under the Carl Moyer program. And these included, providing funding information and staff report at the community steering committee meetings. We're very active at those meetings. We coordinated very closely with the two ports. They have a drayage truck registry that lists 2,200 fleets. These are fleets that, provide service, drayage service to both ports of LA and Port of Long Beach, and terminal operators at both ports. So the ports were very helpful in disseminating our funding announcement to these entities. And we also, our listserv now, it keeps growing each year, but we have over 16,000 subscribers. So of course we send out email blasts to all of the listserv participants. And one thing we did this year, we didn't do last year, was we had a pretty robust list of the warehouse facilities, particularly in the 3 priority communities. So we went ahead and sent specific funding announcements out to those warehouse facilities. And we did some enhanced outreach efforts to ag communities, primarily in Coachella Valley and broader Riverside County community. And we also developed a truck survey. And the purpose of this truck survey was to send out to all trucking companies based on any lists that we can get our hands on, and try and not only provide information on what funding might be available, but also find out that if any of these trucks are operated in any of our priority communities. What we know is that, for example, the San Bernardino community has a lot of warehouses and a lot of trucks visiting those warehouses, but these are trucks that may not be domiciled in that community. They may be parked elsewhere or providing a service from the port to the inland empire and visiting those warehouse facilities. So we tried to capture those truck projects that are, basically servicing that community, operated in that community, but may not be actually domiciled in that community. So that was the whole purpose of our truck survey that we developed this year. And we're planning to continue to use that each year as we move forward. So this slide, I'm going to provide a slide for each of our 3 priority communities that have approved community emission reduction plans. And keep in mind that at the time this announcement was released for the Carl Moyer program, this was prior to any of the community emission reduction plans. Actually, this was during the time when they were being developed, but prior to their approval by South Coast AQMD Governing Board. So we knew these communities were being in the development of the plans, but we didn't yet have any specific actions. But we went ahead and did some of the outreach efforts, and this is the result of some of our efforts. And so these are the projects. I think what you'll find here is what we have already allocated, and we're currently in the process of deployment with year 1. And you'll see I tried to put them in order of the most cleanest technology to maybe, not so clean. But as you know, the Moyer program requires the cleanest available technology. And the Moyer program is focused on both on and off-road, medium and heavy duty vehicles and equipment. So for heavy duty vehicles, this is our heavy duty trucks. What we saw in terms of fleet requests is that they primarily requested cleaner trucks that are certified to the optional low NOx emission standards. These are the trucks that we call near zero trucks. And we got a pretty good response the first year, but a very poor response the second year. So this really raised an eyebrow for us. We're going to do even more targeted outreach for that community as we move forward. The off-road equipment category, we don't have any commercially available zero emission technologies specifically for construction equipment. However, we do have some for a lot of port equipment, cargo handling equipment at warehouse facilities. With regards to San Bernardino Muscoy community, what you see here is primarily the Tier 4 engines for some specific construction equipment. We're being awarded funds, and also Tier 3 engines on some off-road equipment where Tier 4 is not available. So this is what it looks like for the San Bernardino Muscoy community. Now, Wilmington, West Long Beach, Carson, we got a huge response, and really pleased with this response. It could be a lot of the partnerships we had with the port and the additional outreach we did with the port support. And what you see here is we got a few fleets requesting zero emission trucks, which was nice to see, but the vast majority of fleets opted for the near zero emission trucks. And you can see, comparing the two, we're getting a much more basically cost-effective reduction for the low NOx at this time, partly because the zero emission truck pricing is still not well established. It's a very high cost right now. So that seems to be where the program is in demand right now, is for the near zero emission trucks. We also had some emergency equipment. These are diesel to diesel replacements, primarily because they're very unique equipment, fire apparatus, things like that, that they don't have any alternative cleaner options for those equipment. And for the off-road category, you could see we're getting some zero emission. These are actually forklifts, the 24 zero emission forklifts at a warehouse facility. We did get some hybrid electric RTG cranes that we're excited to move forward with. And the Tier 4 and Tier 3, the Tier 3 in this case will be a lot of marine vessel repowering projects, and Tier 4 would be those construction equipment where the Tier 4 engine is available for those specific types of equipment. And infrastructure, Moyer is now, infrastructure is now a category under Moyer. We started this category in 2018 under the Moyer program. So we do see some basically a high demand each year. It seems to be growing each year we're running the program. And in this case, we got some requests for battery electric charging, as well as renewable natural gas fueling sites. And real quick, with regards to East LA, Boyle Heights, West Commerce community, you could see the breakdown here. The numbers are not as robust as Wilmington, but again, this gives us, opens up some opportunities to do some more focused outreach, which we are doing right now as we move forward. This slide just highlights, independent of the communities, what zero emission projects came in case you were wondering. So we did get some 3 applicants, for example, in year 1 that requested zero emission trucks. These are the heavy duty trucks, Class 8 trucks. And these trucks are used primarily to haul grocery products and other goods. And then there's the 24 forklift project we got. That is at a warehouse facility in Long Beach. And variety of infrastructure projects, one specifically at the port to provide charging for zero emission top handlers, another site at a cargo handling facility in Long Beach. That would be for zero emission yard tractors that are used at that facility, and some charging stations for specifically for transport refrigeration units at a warehouse facility. Now, the emission reductions from all these projects sum up to this table. And if you guys are familiar with the emission reduction targets and the community emission reduction plans, they specify, I think it's anywhere between 40 to 50 tons per year of NOx in each of the 3 communities. And as you can see for Wilmington, both year 1 and year 2, we are meeting and exceeding that target. In San Bernardino-Muscoy, due to some specific projects, we met it in year 1, but year 2 we fell short. And East LA, Boyle Heights, Commerce, again, not bad, maybe about 50% of the way there for year 1, but we still need additional reductions moving forward in those communities. And I just wanted to highlight that, both these cycles of the incentive funds were soliciting projects prior to the community emission reduction plans being developed and approved. Now that they're approved, we have specific actions that we will be taking, such as setting up incentive outreach events in these communities and various workshops to try and for example, to try and reach out to independent owner and operators of trucks. We're trying to target these smaller fleets that may own 1 to 3 trucks and try and find out what barriers they have to applying for the incentive fund. So we'll be looking more focused on those types of emission sources. real quick, so what's open now? We have the Prop 1B Goods Movement Program. We have about $30 million remaining. Everybody kind of thinks this program is done. It's been running for 10 years. We must have exhausted all the funds, but we still have 30 million available. This program targets, this specific announcement targets replacement of heavy-duty trucks, heavy-duty diesel trucks with cleaner models. And this program, of all the incentive programs, provides probably the highest incentive amount. So if a fleet wants to purchase a full zero emission truck, they can get up to $2,000 towards the purchase of that truck. And for a near zero, they can get up to $1,000. So that, relative to all the other incentive programs that are out there, this is a pretty nice incentive. And I wanted to mention for these smaller fleets, one of the proposals we're looking at is setting up a pilot program specific to the 3 communities where we specifically offer, kind of a stacking of incentives to be able to give them a higher incentive amount, maybe something that can help pay up to like 90% of the cost for the new truck. And we think that might be a better incentive than what the other program, a lot of the other programs like Moyer have some cost effectiveness limits. And what we're hearing from the communities is we really need to offer a higher incentive to get more small fleets to begin to participate. So that's what we're looking at right now. You may have heard of the Volkswagen settlement program. That settlement set aside $423 million in mitigation funds to the state of California. And ARB is the lead agency for these funds, but what they decided to do was rely on the 3 larger air districts in California to implement these funds. And back in March of last year, ARB approved a beneficiary mitigation plan. And what that plan did was set aside or identify 5 main funding categories for these funds. And these categories are listed here. And South Coast AQMD has been identified as the lead agency to administer 2 of these funding categories. Now, what's unique about this program is that, as South Coast AQMD, we will be administering these programs, these categories and associated funding, not just for projects within our own air basin, within our jurisdiction, but we're going to administer the funds statewide. So, for example, the first category, zero emission transit, school, and shuttle buses. San Joaquin Air Pollution Control District is the lead agency for those funds. They released a program announcement on October 21st for these funds, but they will be soliciting applications statewide. And the way we're going to do that is through online application portals. There will be no hard copy applications allowed. So for all 5 of these categories, they're going to be open through an online application portal. And it'll perhaps feel a little strange for a fleet here applying to San Joaquin for the Volkswagen mitigation funds, but that's how it's been designed. So we will be implementing these categories statewide. The second category, the combustion, freight, and marine projects category, the 4th one listed, we're going to be seeking board approval to release the solicitation for that in December.
Elaine, can you do me a favor and send the links for those to the members so they could forward it on to other folks?
And I should mention the bus category is open right now and it's on a first come, first served basis. So the time to act is now. If you want to disseminate any of that funding information, as Derek mentioned, there's a specific website that provides information. It's a San Joaquin website that you would be visiting to apply for funds for that category. And our Moyer program, you probably are already aware, we run it every year according to pretty much the same cycle. We release the program announcement in March typically, and we close in June. And then we do our evaluations and we bring the recommended awards to the board anywhere between October to December of each year. And I just wanted to kind of gear up for the next cycle. We closed our 2019 program and we're going to be recommending awards to the board in December. Our 2020 program, we're looking at having about 40 million available, and we will be hopefully releasing that in March with board approval. And again, this program is focused on and off-road heavy-duty vehicles and equipment and infrastructure. And here are the useful links. So Derek mentioned the link for the San Joaquin Valley bus category for the VW program is identified here. Since this presentation was primarily focused on the CAP incentive projects, I provided our CAP incentives webpage. So if you want to see a detailed listing of the projects and any community or any project that we're going to be funding using the AB 617 incentives, you can go to that link and see the project listed there and some other additional details. And I just want to mention we have a voucher incentive program for small fleets, and this would be small fleets with 10 trucks or less. We run this program every year on a first come, first served basis. We typically close in December of each year to provide updates to the program. And these are things we're already thinking about, already developing for better outreach moving forward. We're looking at a plus-up incentive for specifically for small trucking fleets. And we do set a priority for all small fleets that are coming in with their applications. That's something we're going to continue. One of the things in the SERPs that were approved is specific outreach events. The community members, want us to do more outreach events where we're actually providing, setting up a specific time and date where we're there providing information, assisting them with application information, gathering documents needed, things like that. And we're always open to any ideas you have on how we might improve our existing outreach efforts. And we do need to, perhaps, as we move along, more zero-emission technologies become available, approved by CARB, we probably need to provide that information to the entities that could take advantage of the incentives. And if you have specific questions or comments on the CAP incentives program, when you visit our website, you actually have to scroll to the bottom and you'll see something there called comments or questions. You can go ahead and click on that and shoot your email over to us and we will respond. And one of the things that's very useful is if you go to our general website, aqmd.gov, and you want to sign up to get funding announcements on any of our programs, you can go ahead and scroll to the bottom and click on newsletter sign up, and you'll have a long list of programs. You can just check off the ones that you want information on, and you'll get alerted of all those notifications. And that's it. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Very good detailed report. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, Rochelle, go ahead.
Just a quick question with regards to this program, but specifically to AB 134 and the tight timeline. Well, one, if you have to liquidate, obligate, all of that within that timeline, what are you doing to ensure that applicants are fully exhausting their program? And two, is there any punitive measure that happens, and would we have to return dollars?
No, these programs are voluntary, so there's no punitive measures if they cancel and don't move forward with the project. We generally have a pretty healthy backup list, so if a fleet falls through, we can quickly reallocate those funds to the next project on the list. We do very close monitoring. They don't just sign a contract with us and not hear from us. We're monitoring the project, waiting. One of the things we do request is that we monitor to see the very first step once they sign a contract with us is whether or not they place their purchase order, because that is a commitment to purchase the cleaner equipment. So we typically ask for a copy of that. And then once they actually get paid for the equipment, we do have a certain number of years we have to monitor the equipment to make sure it's still in service, it's generating emission reductions, operated according to the contract. Yes, sir.
Just looking at the San Bernardino, Muscoy, and Wilmington, Long Beach, Carson project lists. I'm just curious, were any of these participants public sector, or is it all private sector? Or just can you give us a sense of who's applying?
There are some public sector projects in this mix. The first one that comes to mind is the emergency vehicles. That's with City of Long Beach. They're primarily private entities, but public sector are welcome to apply as well.
Okay.
If you need a list, I'd be happy to provide it later.
I was just trying to get a feel of the applicants, but you said that that's online. Going to be able to see the.
Yeah.
Okay.
The applicant name, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, that's it over here, Councilmember Benoit.
Very good. All right. We also have the written report attached, the monthly report on the small business assistance activities. Unless there's any questions on that, we'll go on. Any other business that the members want to bring up or items that we want to look into? I see Rita is getting ready.
Let me guess.
Just reiterating my request for the Rule 219 presentation on outreach to the printing community. Thank you.
As I said, as soon as staff is ready, we're going to give it to you, Rita. Okay, so. But I did want to say, bring up one. Councilman Benoit is our next meeting. So what did you want to do with the next meeting? Usually we have it offsite.
Yeah, over at our little restaurant retreat.
Yep.
Is everyone interested in doing that again?
It looks pretty unanimous, so.
Have consensus. Let's call the roll.
13. Oh, no. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and get it set up for that. We'll do that. And I will join you guys there after I do the admin committee meeting there in Diamond Bar. So with that, is there any other public comment on items not on the agenda? I don't see any here or there. And if that, we'll go to our next meeting will be, like we said, Friday, December 13th. And we'll do it at our little restaurant. All right. Thank you all for coming, and I'll see you guys later.
Great. Thank you.